The peak effect I calculated initially as being April to August 2022. Well, I think if I counted from the time of the eclipse itself, not from July 2020, that would wind it back to February to March, or around February, March, April. And that correlates with peak global Omicron numbers. It correlates with the whole mess in Canada with the Canadian truckers. And it correlates approximately with the onset of the lockdown in Shanghai. So I think that would be much more accurate. Hello, this is Marcos Patchett, the Nocturnal Herbalist, and in this video I will be covering the contemporary astrology of COVID-19. What I mean by that is this is the third video in a series, and the first video, called The Medieval Astrology of COVID-19 in 2020, I made some predictions about the course of the pandemic based on medieval and some Renaissance Western astrological techniques. The second video, released in 2021, I called The Renaissance Astrology of COVID-19, and I used similar techniques, focusing more so on the Renaissance tradition. And in this video, I'm really just going to be recapping those and making some additional predictions, but really just sort of reviewing and making some predictions for what I hope will be the closing phases of the pandemic. I mean, a lot of people are saying that the pandemic is basically over. In one sense, yes, because the panic about it is over, but COVID is still very much present and affecting different parts of the world to varying degrees. So anyway, I'm going to start the video by recapping my global predictions for COVID, the general predictions that I made in the video in 2020 called The Medieval Astrology of COVID-19. Then I'm going to move on and look at the updated predictions for the pandemic, because some of the predictions I made in 2020 I think really are bearing out. The timeline looks right, but there's a couple of things I think I got very wrong, so I want to look more closely at those, and because why would you not? The second thing I want to look at is a couple of horary that I did. Horary astrology is a technique of answering questions in astrology. I discussed horary in both of the previous videos. I want to talk about two horary charts, two astrological charts based on questions, which is really a medieval technique that was very prevalent in sort of Arabian countries and really developed by the Muslim astrologers in the Middle Ages, and then was very popular in Renaissance Europe. So horary astrology is still around today, but the techniques were really developed around then. So I'll be discussing two horary charts today, and then I finally just want to go over the astrological predictions I made for the UK last year and what actually happened. And then I just want to make some predictions for the UK for this year, 2022 into 2023, with respect to COVID. And this, I'm hoping, should be my last video on the astrology of COVID. Take this information from this video with not a pinch of salt, as in like I wouldn't say treat it cheaply, but always just take it as a curiosity, as something to go, that's interesting, and just see what happens. That's kind of how I use astrology. I use it as a bit of a weather report, as something to keep in the corner of my eye and kind of go, what actually happens here? I'm going to start by looking at just reviewing some of the initial predictions I made in the Medieval Astrology of COVID-19 video in 2020. It was published, actually, the video was published on the 16th of May 2020. I actually did the astrology probably from March that year, and it was based on an eclipse chart in Wuhan in December 2019. Now, there were some other earlier eclipse charts in Wuhan that were involved, but that the astrology that I looked at in that video, I felt that that was the most important chart, the December 19 eclipse, solar eclipse in Wuhan in China, that spoke to the global spread of COVID. So just to rehash what I said in that video a little bit, or go over it. Ptolemy, according to Claudius Ptolemy, famous 1st century AD astrologer, in his book Tetrabiblos, or rather the paraphrase of his book written by Proclus, it was that eclipse would have been said to be ruled by Saturn. I explain why in my video in 2020. And he said that Saturn causes lingering diseases, griefs, alarms and deaths, as well as animals, chiefly among persons advanced in age, as well as animals serviceable to man. And some of the predictions that I made in that video was that this would mess up hospitals and long distance travel. Well, at the time the video was released, that was already happening. The virus will cause confusion and medical miscommunication. Again, that was already well underway, but some of the longer term predictions I made in that video were that the disease will mutate and get weaker over time. More than one variety will emerge as it spreads overseas, and in the process become weaker. Now, that is by no means guaranteed. When viruses evolve, they can become more pathogenic. What we've seen, in fact, is that COVID has tended to, over time, indeed become weaker, more transmissible, but weaker. The time frame I gave in that video was for 3 years and 5 months, more or less, duration of COVID. So the global pandemic should be officially over, as it were, by November, December 2023. So at the time of recording this video in July 2022, we're still in it. The maximum effects of COVID, and this is one of the things I got wrong by about 3 or 4 months, and this I will discuss later, will manifest by June, July 2020. In other words, according to my initial prediction, the peak global effects of COVID would be around now in June, July 2020. And in fact, I think, as I say, I was about 3 to 4 months out. I think they were 3 to 4 months back, and I'll discuss why astrologically, or what might be going on there astrologically. My assumption, by the way, for those who haven't gathered, is that the astrology is right. It's human interpretation of it that is fallible. Some skeptics may disagree. That's fine. That's their prerogative. But mine as an astrologer is to go back and look at the astrology and my interpretation of it. And I also suggested that around the 4th to the 6th of June, when Saturn retrograded, June 2022, that is, the disease would be strong, resurging in China, leading to some panic and maybe a return to lockdown in Wuhan, and drastic or punitive actions by governments worldwide. Well, that didn't happen. Again, I think, at least not that I'm aware of, I think that kind of stuff was really more suitable for a couple of months previously. I did specify, however, that this was not necessarily COVID itself, but the consequences of COVID, and these will vary from country to country. And some other predictions or things that I said in that video based on that chart were that governments will deal with it well through quarantine and strict measures. It depends on your opinion on that. There'll be some help from medicine and government, but there will be, as a result of COVID and the pandemic, a fall from grace of corrupt rulers, a temporary increase in government restrictions, oppression and control, which ultimately results in the purging of corruption from the ranks of government. Now, bear in mind, we're not at the end of that timing period, as it were, in sort of like late 2023. I think this process is still underway. Hope so. So now I actually wrote a whole article based on these predictions, which was published in Infinity Astrological Magazine on July the 13th of 2020, called The Traditional Astrology of COVID-19, where I went into all the charts I discussed in that video in even more detail. I'll pop a link to that article below. Unfortunately, the whole article isn't free. You'd have to buy the edition of the magazine if you really wanted to read it, but I'll put the link below anyway. Some other predictions I made in April 2022. This was based on a conjunction of Mars and Saturn in Aquarius happening in April 2022. The quote in that video was, I think this was written, this has appeared on the screen rather than me saying it, may see another lockdown for Wuhan and may indicate a critical and challenging time globally where governments step in with more social control measures. I don't think that was Wuhan. I think that was the Shanghai situation. So in China, for sure, I don't know what was going on in Wuhan specifically at that time, but I think things were pretty strict there, but definitely that was applicable to perhaps China more broadly and Shanghai in specific. In the article in Infinity, I also put that around early June 2022, 6th of June 2022, this was based on Saturn turning stationary retrograde in Aquarius, squaring Mars in the initial consultation, in the initial eclipse chart, and Mercury being on Algol squaring Saturn at the time. I won't go into all the astrology. For anyone who wants to geek out on what all of that, you can have a look at the article. Also watch the initial video where I explain all the astrology in detail. But at that time, I suggested that this will inflate the disease and any hysteria surrounding it. The illness itself may be causing problems, but a certain violent madness and misinformation propagated by the media will build opposition to the government, and the government may take drastic and immoral actions such as imposing martial law ostensibly to quell the sickness. Again, I think this period, therefore, looking at the Wuhan chart from April 2022 to June 2022 was probably reflective of the Shanghai situation and a lot of the situation in China relating to COVID. So bear in mind, China is a significant chunk of the world's population. I don't know, I think 18% of the world's population resides in China. Next to that, the USA is only 4 to 2% of it. India is the next biggest country at 17.5%. So China is the country in the world with the single largest percentage of the world's population inhabiting it. So this astrology is talking about COVID for the world as a whole, not for individual countries. So I am going to count that as correct. That those specific predictions that I made in Infinity magazine, I think were broadly correct. However, what I don't think I was right on, what I think I was wrong on, was that the peak COVID craziness globally would be April to August 2022. I don't think that was correct. I think I was 3 to 4 months out there. And I think the reason for that was I was using the eclipse chart to time the onset of the effects. And again, I discuss all the astrology for this in that first video in 2020 called Medieval Astrology of COVID-19. Using Ptolemy's methodology, he suggested it be around 6 to 7 months. And I timed the onset of that effect from the time, well, this is difficult to explain. I did explain it in that first video, but basically the onset of the effect, I misunderstood it to be from the time when Ptolemy said the eclipse would be fully manifest in the world. So he said it would be about 6 to 7 months from the eclipse before its effects were fully manifest. And I thought the duration of the effects of the eclipse would be timed from then, and its peak maximal effect would be timed from then. I don't think that was right. I think the timing was from the actual time of the eclipse itself. So in other words, just to recap some of the astrology, Ptolemy said if the eclipse happened on the eastern horizon, the effects would be immediate, happening right now. If the eclipse was on the midheaven or in the middle of the sky, the effects would be happening in about 6 months. And if the eclipse was on the western horizon, or just going below the horizon, then the effects would manifest in about a year's time, 12 months. And based on that, he also said the duration of the effects, how long they last, would be the same in years as the eclipse lasted in hours. That's pretty simple. And then the third thing he said was the peak effect would be proportionate to where the eclipse was taking place in the sky. So in other words, the peak effect would be right now if the eclipse was happening on the eastern horizon, like sunrise position. The peak effect would be about halfway through the time period if the eclipse was happening right in the middle of the sky, and the peak effect would be right at the end of the period if the eclipse was happening on the western horizon. So say you had an eclipse that lasted 3 hours, he would say the duration of the effects would last 3 years, and say the eclipse was happening in the middle of the sky, Ptolemy would say that the eclipse effects would be fully manifest in the world in about 6 months from the time of the eclipse itself. The eclipse would then last 3 years because it lasted 3 hours, and that because the eclipse was happening in the middle of the sky, like literally halfway through, the maximal effects would be halfway through that 3-year period. In other words, about 1.5 years through the duration of the effects. My mistake was to calculate as if that halfway through was from the onset of what he said would be the onset of the effects. So in other words, with the example I've just given you, Ptolemy, if you have an eclipse happening in the middle of the sky, Ptolemy would say the effects begin in about 6 months' time. My mistake was to say, okay, that eclipse, if the eclipse lasts 3 hours, it'd be 3 years from that 6 months ahead, and then it would be about 1.5 years from there. So in total, the peak effect would be 1.5 years plus 6 months. In other words, about 2 years and 1 month or whatever it is. My maths is terrible, but you get it. It's further in the future. Let me read the passage from Ptolemy's Tetrabiblos, the translation that I have, and you can see why I got it messed up. But I think, in fact, the correct calculation would be to have done the timing from the time of the eclipse itself. In other words, in the example I've just given you, if the eclipse is in the middle of the sky and it lasted 3 hours, then the effects would be fully manifest in the world in 6 months' time. The effects would be expected to last 3 years, but the peak effects would be about halfway through that 3-year period, but that would be calculated from the time of the eclipse. So in other words, the peak effects would be in about 1.5 years from the time of the eclipse itself, not from the time of when the effect was supposed to be fully manifest in the world. So not from 1.5 years plus 6 months. If you see what I mean. So not from 2 years ahead, but from 1.5 years ahead, if that makes sense. This is the initial and slightly confusing passage, but I think on rereading it, the second interpretation makes more sense. So he says, the commencement of the effect, talking about eclipses. This is from Ptolemy's Tetrabiblos, Book 2, Chapter 7, Eclipses, the time and period of the event. The commencement of the effect and the period of its general intensity or strength are to be inferred from the situation of the place of the eclipse with respect to the angles. If the ecliptical place be near the eastern horizon, the effect will begin to be manifested in the course of the first 4 months after the date of the eclipse, and its general height or intensity will take place in or about the first third part of the whole extent of its duration. If the ecliptical place happen to be in or near the midheaven, the effect will begin to appear in the second 4 months, and its general intensity will occur about the second third part. And if the place should fall near the western horizon, the effect will begin in the third 4 months and take its general intensity in the last third part of its whole duration. So I don't know why I interpreted it the other way first time round. I think I was making it more complicated than it needed to be. So in other words, what my calculation of when the global effects would be most crazy was probably out by about 3 or 4 months. So looking back at it, the peak effect, if I'm calculating from the time of the eclipse, not from the time of the onset, the main global onset of the effects, because the eclipse actually occurred in December 2019. I calculated that the main onset of effects, because it was just after the midheaven, so just after the middle of the sky, would be in about 7 months. So it would be around January, February, March, April, May, June, July would be around July 2020 from the peak global sort of onset, not the peak, but the main global sort of effect, the full manifestation of the effect of that eclipse, if you like, in the world. And then the peak effect I calculated initially as being April to August 2022. Well, I think if I counted from the time of the eclipse itself, not from July 2020, that would wind it back to February to March, or around February, March, April. And that would correlate with, and that I think would be much more accurate, that correlates with peak global Omicron numbers. It correlates with the whole mess in Canada with the Canadian truckers, and it correlates approximately with the onset of the lockdown in Shanghai. So I think that would be much more accurate. So I just want to do a quick retrospective of the UK predictions for 2021 to 2022 and see what I got right and wrong there. So looking back at those predictions that I made for March to June 2021, I think the predictions of new beginnings and growth of the disease in the UK, that was absolutely spot on. There was the new South African strain, I think B1.351 or something, a beta variant. That was interesting. That was reduced infection numbers, but those numbers definitely climbed towards the summer solstice. So there was a new beginning and there was a growth of the disease in that period. There were definitely some increased, publicization of more vaccination reactions, particularly through some YouTube channels like Dr. John Campbell actually started reporting on vaccination reactions which were happening, and legal rulings in support of the vaccination program. I'm not sure if that was happening, but I assume that was something along the lines of there was an extension of the vaccination program to other age groups. So there definitely was legal endorsement of that kind of thing happening. Then I've got the predictions I made for UK July to September were still good freedom generally. Some restrictions may be about to be reintroduced, but there would be reduced restrictions on travel and higher education, although somewhat temporarily. Some of those restrictions might be coming back, I thought. Increased financial boost for people's, for people's incomes. So especially through pubs, restaurants, food and drink industries, and conflicts over education and travel, especially primary education, anger and controversy over the government's going back on promises on education and travel. So that was for July, September 2021 in the UK. So I'm not sure how much of that was right or not. There was this sort of increased green list of countries, like more countries were added to the green list for travel. So there definitely was more travel, and there was reduction in government borrowing and falling unemployment. So definitely I think the financial thing, and obviously things opening up and the pubs and all of that so I think that was correct. And I do think there was some controversy over the government's approach to returning travellers, for sure. That was a contentious issue. I'm not sure about the education stuff. I don't know. I don't read the papers. I barely pay attention to what's going on. So this is probably not the most thorough examination of what I got right. I can only look at what I know about, and those things I think I got right. I'm not sure about the education stuff. I also suggested for that July-September period in 2021 last year that there would be higher infection numbers in northeast England, and that the quarter would begin, that summer quarter last year would begin with falling COVID numbers and end with some reintroduction of travel restrictions and some reintroduction of higher education closures or restrictions and some reintroduction of healthcare restrictions. But actual infection numbers would be falling overall. So what actually happened? No, I don't think there were higher infection numbers in the northeast of England. In fact, it was the opposite. There were higher infection numbers. The highest was in Cornwall. But I do think that there was some, the people in the north, there were 17% more likely to die from COVID-related illnesses. So it hit the north in terms of severity more, but I was completely wrong about the numbers. The quarter definitely began with falling COVID numbers. I don't know if it ended with some reintroduction of travel restrictions, higher education closures. I don't think so. I think that may have been wrong. I'm not sure. Actual infection numbers falling. I think that was correct. But again, I'm not sure. So that was, I'd say that was about 60% accurate. Not great. And then September to December 2021 so last year, my predictions were not in lockdown, but some increase of restrictions, which I think was accurate. Increased rebelliousness from the people. People were very unhappy with the government, more divided opinion, pro and anti-lockdown public, increased unhappiness with the government, increased feeling of hidden agendas with sickness, secret agendas being played out. I don't know, but I think this is broadly accurate. I think there was more people just not wearing masks and not doing things anymore. And that's partly because the official mandates were not reintroduced fully, but it's partly, I think, people were just sick of it and were voting with their feet, so to speak. I think also the other prediction I made was COVID was not too severe, but increasing numbers. In other words, infection numbers in this quarter, increased technological developments and understanding of COVID through stats and study, increasing numbers of children affected, and possibly increasing heart and kidney inflammation as a result of COVID. I think all of those things were broadly true. Certainly the increasing numbers was true because Omicron came about, more children being affected, for sure. Increasing technological developments through stats and study, I think that was broadly true. So, but I don't know about the heart and kidney thing, maybe, but that was for the end of last year. And then the final set of predictions I made for the UK in last year's videos were for December 2021 to March 2022. I said that we wouldn't be in lockdown, but not complete freedom. Authorities or bosses in the media, rich or important people, would be opposing the public or maybe moving overseas. I have no idea what that meant or whether that happened or not. Like rich media people opposing the public and moving overseas in the last quarter of last year. That was a prediction I made. I don't even know whether that happened or not. No idea. The public, I said, would generally be a bit happier. I think that was true because we weren't in lockdown and things were sort of more normal. Increased deaths in hospitals and care homes, problems in hospitals, and discussion of pay for nurses. Well, certainly January 2022, there was the highest number of doctors who had COVID to date. This was Omicron, of course. So I don't know about deaths in hospitals. I don't think that was correct, but certainly the hospitals thing, there was the highest number of healthcare workers with COVID was in January 2022. Concerns over healthcare and resources, that was certainly true in March 2022. Towards the end of that quarter, there was big childcare funding concerns. I popped a link to a couple of articles substantiating that in the links below this video. COVID numbers not so high, but still ongoing. That was very wrong. They were the highest ever. But I've got numbers creeping up, COVID spreading, numbers going up, but reducing disease intensity. That was spot on because we actually had, I was completely wrong about the numbers not so high, highest ever, but the bit that I was right about was that the numbers were going up, but the disease intensity was reducing. Very mixed signals, I said, about this chart, and that money was a bit healthier. So those are my predictions last year. I'm going to give myself a solid 70% for accuracy for the UK. Some of them were a bit off. I'm going to give myself 70%, knowing fully that I'm ignorant of a lot of what actually happens in the news. And the problem is with trawling back through Wikipedia and looking at what's happened, you're only getting half a picture, and it's an edited, curated picture at that. So maybe people can put in the comments other things that might have happened, things that might have either, corroborated the astrology or that disconfirmed it. So anyway, so that was that, and then I'm just gonna next go over some of my predictions for the UK for 2022 to 2023, which will hopefully take us up to the end of the pandemic globally, officially. So just to look at the Aries ingress in the UK for 2022, this is the chart for the exact moment the sun entered tropical Aries. That's to say on the 20th of March 2022. And for the benefit of anyone listening to this as a podcast, the chart has 2 Virgo rising, and the chart is set for London in the UK at 3:33 p.m. So this chart, I've kind of been a bit lazy this time because I'm just doing a chart for the Aries ingress, or the spring equinox in the northern hemisphere, and then I'm going to do a chart for the autumn ingress on, I think, the 20th of September. And the reason for that is because this chart in spring has Virgo rising, and one of the traditional rules for ingress charts is when they had a movable or cardinal sign rising, you would do a new chart every 3 months. When they had a mutable or double-bodied or bicorporeal sign rising, such as Virgo, Pisces, Sagittarius, Gemini, then the chart would be valid for 6 months. And when that spring equinox chart had a fixed sign rising, such as Taurus, Leo, Scorpio, or Aquarius, then the chart would be valid for the whole year. So this chart has Virgo rising. So while I could go on and look at another chart for the spring, for the summer solstice, or for the sun's entry into Cancer, I'm just going to look at this one chart for the next 6 months. So at the time of recording this, we are already in July, so this chart is well underway. So just to look at it, I'll start with illness and COVID. So I'm going to look at the 6th house of this chart, which is the part of the chart relating to illness. And we've got Aquarius on the cusp, with Mars just inside the cusp at 10 degrees Aquarius, Venus at 13 Aquarius, and Saturn, the ruler of the 6th house, in Aquarius at 20 degrees. What that implies to me is that we're going to have ongoing a persistence or ongoing airborne illness. So COVID is still with us, basically. And it's still fairly severe because we've got Mars and Saturn in Aquarius. But it's not as bad as it has been. And the reason I say that is because we've got a couple of factors that are I would say, mitigating. The first would be that Venus is present in the house as well, and Venus rules the 10th house of medicine, and we have the North Node conjunct the 10th cusp. So I think by now there are certain protocols and medicines that people are aware of, whether conventional or not conventional, that will have a mitigating effect. That would be the rule of the 10th in the 6th, Venus generally sort of damping down that Mars. The second factor is that the moon in this chart is at 29 degrees Libra. It's a waning moon. It's past the full moon. So that implies a situation that's overall diminishing or in its waning phase. Now, the moon at 29 Libra is in a part of the zodiac called the Via Combusta, or the burned up way, which is between 15 Libra and 15 Scorpio. So the moon in the chart represents generally the mood of the people, also represents generally the flow of events, and the moon in this chart for the UK from, say, end of March 2022 to sort of towards the end of September this year would also rule the 11th house with Cancer on the cusp, which is the people's hopes and goals and wishes and earnings as well. So the moon in the Via Combusta implies that the public mood is a bit unstable or troubled. The same goes for earnings. The same goes for people sort of like, people aren't sure what, in terms of their hopes and aims and goals. There's a bit of emotional unrest, let's put it that way. And the moon is about to enter the sign of Scorpio and then apply to square Mars in the 6th house. The way I interpret that, a square to Mars implies that there's upcoming increase in airborne illness, But there are two significant mitigating factors. The first, as I say, is the moon is waning, it's showing decrease, and traditionally it was said it was much better to have the moon waning when applying to Mars, because waning is like the moon represents things that are decreasing. It's a bit like cooling or reducing. So if you've got the moon applying to Mars, which signifies fevers and infections and illnesses, then that's good. And the second mitigating factor is the moon will be applying to Mars from Scorpio, which is Mars's own sign. That's what's called reception in traditional astrology, where you have the moon applying to the ruler of the sign it's in. So that really significantly reduces the harm. So the way I see this going, COVID's still going to be with us. It's persisting. There's a little bit of mitigation from medicine while it's severe. And it's, you know, it's still going to be some severe. It's not as bad as it has been in the past. And even though the numbers of people who are infected with COVID may increase towards the end of this half of the year, sort of as we start heading into autumn, it's not going to be super bad. It's going to be a nasty airborne disease, but it's not that bad. It's not that bad, relative to previous charts, I would say. Second things I see in this chart, we've got, I'm noticing that Mars with Saturn in the sixth house, as well as illness, relates to sort of service industry and that kind of thing. And whenever you have Mars with Saturn, I tend to think there may be some more strikes and things like that happening. And I was thinking the fact that we've got the moon in the third house, which relates both to primary education and to transport and to media, in the via combustor, sort of troubled and upset, applying to that square of Mars, Mars in the same sign as Saturn, and Venus, the ruler of the third house, wedged between Mars and Saturn in the sixth. That's a placement in traditional astrology called besieged, when a planet is stuck between the two naughty planets, Mars and Saturn. It's besieged by them. Then I would say that indicates that there may be some strikes or strifes in this part of the year associated particularly with transport and communications sectors, perhaps associated with harsh working conditions and lack of support. May also be issues with primary schools and sort of contention in these sectors, particularly around COVID or illness related policies or issues, I would think. Certainly we've seen a lot of transport strikes in London, because I don't pay any attention to the news. I have no idea what's going on in the rest of the country half the time, but that seems to be what the astrology is saying for this part of the year. As I mentioned, the moon in the via combustor heading into Scorpio, which is the sign of its fall. The people are confused and a bit weak, but maybe the other factor is the people of the country in the chart, we've got Virgo rising, are represented by Mercury in the seventh house in Pisces, applying to conjunct Jupiter in Pisces. That's an interesting one because the ruler of the first house, Mercury in Pisces, it's in its detriment and fall. It sort of implies that the people are confused, their focus is on sort of overseas, and they aren't in a strong position, but that something about overseas, the seventh house in this chart representing foreign places, overseas in general, maybe trade partners, that kind of thing, maybe supporting us in some way. So the way I interpreted this was people are confused and a bit weak, maybe supported by trade partners overseas, perhaps some sort of negotiations to be made. The UK might be on the losing side of any negotiations because Mercury, the ascendant ruler representing the people, is literally in the power of opponents or people overseas. And according to a traditional astrologer who does mundane astrology, Ramsay, who wrote Astrologia Munda, this big book about mundane astrology or the astrology of world events, he says when Mercury is the lord of the year or the ascendant ruler and is angular, in this case in the seventh house, he says fish, and it's in a water sign, fish shall abound and want of provisions and fruits of the earth shall occur. That's Mercury in a water sign, not in good shape. That's interesting because we've got Mercury in terrible shape, but applied to this really strong, dignified Jupiter with reception in Jupiter's own sign. So the way I see that is there may be some supply chain issues, food issues, particularly to do with fish or marine stuff, but that trade partners will have to make some treaties, probably on the terms of foreigners, or not on our own, not in terms of saying our, I mean in the UK, not on the UK's own terms, on the terms of trade partners. And they will be broadly supportive. In other words, has to accept trade deals on the terms of overseas partners. I've written here money crap because Mercury also rules the second house of money. And as we've discussed, the 11th house of income is ruled by the moon, which is in the Via Combustor, about to go into Scorpio. So people's earnings are taking a bit of a hit. I'm not sure whether that might not be because of inflation, Mercury applying to Jupiter. That's certainly seems to be what's happening at the moment. Increased profits for overseas and trade partners, but bad for UK. And then the final thing I really wanted to pick up in this chart is that Saturn in the 6th house, the rule of the 6th, also the rule of the 5th, but Saturn is the rule of disease here, airborne disease and social boundaries and stuff, is squaring the midheaven and the IC. The midheaven is the part of the chart that represents the government and medicine, and the IC, the bottom bit of the chart, represents sort of the country, the land, the actual land and the housing market and things like that. And we've got Saturn at 20 degrees Aquarius in the 6th house, and the midheaven is at 23 Taurus, the IC is at 23 Scorpio. So I wondered whether that might be social restrictions, social being Aquarius, restrictions being Saturn, associated with COVID, because it's in the 6th house of illness, continue to negatively impact work and domestic life. Now that's interesting because in the UK at the moment, there don't seem to be that many social restrictions. So maybe some of them will come back in, but maybe it's impacting things in a sort of hidden way. Maybe this is a fallout of previous social restrictions, given this is a waning moon chart. Also, I noted here, and I wrote this interpretation a couple of months ago, FYI, the Queen, because I'm looking here at the 10th house as rulers, and we've got Taurus on the 10th house ruled by Venus, which is a female planet, may get very ill because we've got the Venus in the 6th house, and Venus is applying to conjoin Saturn, the ruler of the 6th, and is besieged, as mentioned, between Mars and Saturn. We also have the Sun, which is the general ruler of the monarch or king, anybody in charge, in the 8th house of death or suffering. But the Sun is here in Aries, very strong, and while Venus is not particularly strong in Aquarius in the 6th, it's applying to Saturn in Saturn's own sign. So again, there's a reception there. Saturn is receiving Venus. It will make sure it's not seriously harmed. But it's in the 6th house of illness. So the way I'd look at that is Venus at the time of the equinox on the 20th of March was at 1326 of Aquarius, and it actually conjoined Saturn at 21 degrees 44. So it had 8 degrees and 23 minutes before it conjoined Saturn. So I thought, in the context of this timing, given that we know this chart has a lifespan of 6 months, if you like, in terms of its validity, that might represent a span of time of about 8 1/3 weeks or so, which would take us to mid-May 2022. That 8 degrees 23 minutes might be just over 8 1/3 weeks, which would take us from the 20th of March to around mid-May 2022. And what actually happened, because as I say, I'm recording this at the beginning of July, the Queen missed Thanksgiving service on the 2nd of June, and it was reported that she was having episodic mobility problems. Now, as I say, it does imply that the reception with Saturn there indicates recovery, but given that Saturn is in a fixed sign in the 6th house of illness, but with ongoing or chronic age-related issues, Saturn being the planet of aging, which of course fits because the Queen is, however old she is now, 96 or something. She's quite old. So yeah, that makes sense. Anyway, all right, so that's chart number 1. Chart number 2 for the year, the Libra ingress in the UK, or the autumn equinox in the Northern Hemisphere, but this is set for London again. The chart, this is on the 23rd of September. I misspoke earlier. It's the 23rd of September, 2022, set for London at 2:03 a.m. And the chart has 9 degrees of Leo rising, with 19 degrees of Aries on the midheaven. So this is an interesting one. We've got the ruler of the chart, because it's Leo rising, is the Sun in Libra in the 3rd house. And it's conjunct Mercury, which is also at 0 Libra, but retrograde. So, and the 3rd house, as discussed previously, is the house of primary schools, of transport, of the media, of communications. So we've got a double signification of communication here, because we've got 3rd house with Mercury retrograde and combust conjunct the Sun in the 3rd. So I would say here we've got this part of the year this chart will take us up from the 23rd of September 2022 all the way through to spring 2023, because that first chart for the year had that Virgo rising, which implied that you do 2 charts for the year. So this chart for the autumn equinox in London will signify what's going to be going on in the UK until March 2023. So we've got many rumors, because the Sun's in the 3rd house in Libra. Libra is an air sign. It's all about conversation and chat and stuff. Problems and issues with transport continuing, because Mercury's combust in the 3rd, and communications delays and breakdowns, because we've got the Sun in its fall in Libra in the 3rd house conjunct to combust Mercury. There's also likely to be some loss of income, because it happens that the Sun also rules the 2nd house of people's money, and it's in the 3rd house, which is what's known traditionally as a cadent house. It means falling away. We've also got the 11th house of people's income, and the reason the 11th house of people's income is because it's the 2nd house from the 10th. In other words, it's like the 10th house being government or work. The 2nd house is money. So the 2nd from the 10th means your wages, your money from work. And that house, the 11th house, has Mars in it, which always indicates problems, and it's ruled by that Mercury, which is combust in the 3rd. So I'm seeing here there's loss of income, problems with communications and travel and transport, and people greatly concerned with this. Now, there is some help from Venus in Virgo in the 3rd house. Venus is ruling the 4th house in this chart, because we've got Libra on the IC, and it's partly ruling the 10th house of government. Venus is in fall in Virgo. It's not very strong, but it does have what's called a generosity with Mercury, because Venus is in Virgo in Mercury's sign, and Mercury is in Libra, which is Venus's sign. So it's kind of like there'll be some support for primary schools, for transport, for the media, from perhaps government agencies, from, I don't know, from sort of domestic, I don't know what the 4th house could be, something to do with land and property. I'm not sure, but I wanted to focus on illness in this chart. So again, let's look at the 6th house of illness. Well, we've got 13 Capricorn on the cusp of the 6th. So the 6th house is again ruled by Saturn, and Saturn in this chart is retrograde in the 7th house in Aquarius, 19 degrees. So we have a return of airborne illness, and I think here what we're seeing is some return of perhaps travel restrictions or restrictions for going overseas, because 7th house is overseas. The 9th house is long distance travel, but the 7th house in mundane charts is overseas. So some return of illness, and perhaps there might have been increased travel overseas, particularly in the previous quarter, but that may be reversed, perhaps because of fears or worries about COVID. And there may be some problems and opposition to overseas students associated with financial considerations. Why do I say that? Because we have the ruler of the ascendant, the Sun in Libra, with that Mercury in the 3rd house opposing Jupiter in Aries in the 9th house. Jupiter in Aries in the 9th is ruling, some children making noise outside. Jupiter in the 9th house we've got Pisces on the cusp of the 9th. So Jupiter rules the 9th house is what I'm trying to say. And Jupiter also rules the 5th house. 5th house sometimes is children and entertainment, but the ninth house is long distance travel, that sort of thing. So we definitely have some opposition to long distance travel. We have some opposition to parties or holidays. We may have some opposition to the return of students from overseas. That's what I'm thinking that may represent. So a bit of controversy about that. Maybe some people having difficulties getting back from overseas in sort of between September and March next year. I would also think of Saturn here as the ruler of the sixth house of illness, being retrograde in the seventh. Saturn is in Aquarius, which is a western and northern sign. It's sort of west, west, north. So I'd be looking at also, in addition to the illness stuff, we might have things with treaties or partners overseas. Some of those might be reneging on contracts, maybe closing borders or causing problems in some way, and that or recalling debts. And those powers might be, as I say, west, west, north. So we'd be looking at America and Canada, and maybe problems in those countries. I mean, there have been, so, you know, but also possibly Germany and Italy, specifically in Europe, because according to William Lilly, the famous English Renaissance astrologer, Aquarius rules those countries. Again, in this chart, interestingly, same with the previous chart for 2022. This is obviously, this chart spills over into 2023. The moon is void, of course. In this chart, the moon is in Leo, so it's not quite as troubled as it was in the previous chart. So even though the mood of the people is not great because people are in full, so I think their money's falling off, people are having problems with jobs and money and transport and travel and things like that. People are concerned about that. Overall, the mood of the people isn't quite as upset or unsettled, interestingly, as in the previous chart. I don't think it's the only issue is that the moon is in the term of Mars, so people are a bit irritated and I would say maybe concerned with sort of loss of wages or rising expenses. Why do I say that? The moon at 26 Leo is in Mars's term. Mars is in the 11th house of wages in Gemini. Mars is ruling the 10th house of government and also of medicine. So the people are going to be really talking about vaccination here because Gemini rules the arms, Mars is surgery or injections, it rules the 10th house of medicine, blah, blah, blah. So there's going to be lots of talk about vaccination in this second part of the year. Perhaps no surprise. For good or for bad. And we're also going to be having discussions about loss of wages and rising expenses and cost of living, etc., as if that hasn't been happening already. But the moon's void, of course, so that implies that there may not be any great progress in this sort of latter third of 2022 into 2023. The moon eventually does move into Virgo, where it applies eventually to a square of Mars. So there may be rising public concern about, for example, vaccination programs, about the actions of government, perhaps deemed irresponsible as far as the management of money and food and medicine is concerned. So my summary that I wrote down was people are still worried about money and resources, not much change. Still some, I think, increase of airborne illness in this quarter or return of it. Why? Because we've got that moon again void but applying to Mars, this time without reception, so without that mitigating condition. But the moon is in its final quarter. It's even closer to the sun than it was in the previous chart. So I do think we're in, relatively speaking, the closing chapters of COVID now. And also the moon is separating from an opposition to Saturn, which is the ruler of the sixth house of illness, and that aspect of Mars. So while numbers are rising in this quarter, because we've got, I think, that retrograde Saturn, the ruler of the sixth house of illness, in an angle. So airborne illness and restrictions to prevent that illness are prominent. I don't think the numbers are going to be super high, actually. There is going to be an increase in cases through the autumn and winter for sure, because the moon is heading gradually, slowly towards that square of Mars. But we're definitely in the folding phases, I think. And then the final chart I want to look at for the UK, I think for the last chapter of COVID, metaphorically speaking, or literally, if you're religious, God willing, would be the 20th of March 2023, which and this chart is set again for London at 9:24 p.m. in London, and we have the sun, of course, at 0 Aries. So it's 9:24 at 20th of March 2023 London, and the chart has 4 degrees Scorpio rising, with the south node at 4 degrees of Scorpio exactly on the ascendant, and 16 degrees Leo on the midheaven. So this chart has a fixed sign rising. The angles are all fixed. So this chart is valid for the whole year from 2023 to 2024 for the UK. What's fascinating here is we have the south node, an eclipse point, right on the ascendant. The ascendant in this chart represents the people. It represents the country, and the south node is a weakening, enervating point. We also have Venus at 4 degrees Taurus right on the descendant on the north node. So this chart shows a really strong, beneficial, helpful Venus in the 7th house of overseas powers. So I think this is a relatively good year for making contracts and dealing with people overseas, but a relatively weakening year for the UK. We've also got the part of fortune, which is sort of a composite point between the sun and the moon and the ascendant, at 15 degrees Scorpio in the ascendant. Part of fortune, as you might imagine from the name, indicates money. It also indicates the sort of health of the people, and that's right on a star called the South Scale, or Zuben el-Ganubi, and that star is a Mars-Saturn star. It often signifies sickness, and it's sometimes referred to as the insufficient price. So right away, I'm seeing in this chart loss of money, loss of health for people in the UK. So this is actually going to be quite a health challenging year for the UK, interestingly. In terms of COVID, because that's what we were initially looking at, and my initial prediction was that 2023, the latter half of the year, we're going to get a sort of official global winding down of the pandemic COVID narrative. We've got Aries, 14 degrees Aries on the cusp of the 6th house. We've also got Jupiter in Aries at 16 degrees. That's quite positive generally. It means illness will be alleviated a little bit. The issue here is that we have Mars, the ruler of the ascendant, Scorpio rising, ruled by Mars, also rules the 6th house, which is the house of illness, in the 8th house in Gemini at 27 degrees Gemini in the 8th. The way I see that is that people are sort of driving their own illness. There's a link between the people and the illness, and really that's about anxiety, that's about how they're communicating about it. However, illness itself with Jupiter in the 6th is not going to be so severe. So it's an interesting chart because we have the people weak, loss of health, loss of money, lots of anxiety, lots of talk of death and illness and things like that, but illness itself being somewhat alleviated. What else to say? Venus is the lord of the year in this chart. So as I've said, it's good relationships with and mended fences really with overseas powers. The reason I say mended fences, good contracts, that sort of thing, is because we also have in this chart Saturn at 1 degrees Pisces. Venus is in a sextile, a friendly aspect to that Saturn. Also receiving Saturn in Pisces, because Pisces is Venus's sign of exaltation. So putting that together, because Saturn is all about contracts and sort of binding conditions. So friendly aspect with Venus, the ruler of the 7th, which is overseas powers, with Saturn in the 4th. That means sort of good domestic treaties about trade and about debt negotiation and maybe about sort of property, particularly with overseas powers and that sort of thing. So that's a positive. But as I say, there are money issues in this chart. Mars also rules the second house, and being placed in the eighth, it's definitely increased spending and increased debt, and some increased illness in the year, but definitely the final phase of the pandemic. And really fascinatingly, the moon in this chart is almost new. It's like really in its final phase. So it's really interesting to me to see the previous significant ingress charts, the Aries ingress of 2022, then the Libra ingress, and now this Aries ingress 2023. It went from just after a full moon to the final quarter to almost a new moon in this final chart for 2023 for the UK. We have the moon at 18 degrees Pisces, and obviously it's an Aries ingress chart, so the sun is at 0 Aries, so the moon is really just 11 degrees and change away from the sun. So it's the final closing phase of a particular chapter. Now the moon is applying to a square of Mars conjunct Neptune. I think that indicates there is going to be some issue with increased illness, but I wonder whether that illness, as I've been talking about, may be somewhat driven by the people, caused by the people themselves through sort of anxiety. There may be a lot of misinformation, a lot of talk of drug reactions. Why? Because Mars is squaring Neptune at 25 Pisces. Neptune, a modern planet, signifies weird reactions, allergies, strange, diffuse sort of odd reactions, and also delusion, and misinformation, that sort of thing. So we've got sort of the Mars square Neptune really disperses. It's kind of like, I always run into word problems when talking about Neptune, because the planet itself symbolically represents diffuse, nebulous, unclear, delusional sort of situation. So Mars square Neptune, it's sort of like all of those things related to illness and surgery, and in this case I think vaccinations. So all of that stuff will contribute to people suffering in different ways. So I think, and also the final thought I had was the fact that the first ruler and the sixth ruler are the same planet. There's going to be an acknowledgement in 2023 that COVID is fully endemic, and also with Jupiter, the benefic, the helpful planet in the sixth house, that it's relatively benign. It's not good. It's still an illness, but it's gone endemic. It's weakening to the people. People are going to be really anxious about it, and there's going to be as much information as there ever has been, and maybe some more talk of vaccination reactions and sort of treatment problems. But there's going to be an acknowledgement that it's become endemic, and that the disease itself is, by this point, relatively benign, I think. The ascendant ruler Mars, which represents the people, does eventually go into Cancer, into the sign of its fall, and then trine Saturn, which will be by then retrograde in the fourth house. The way I see that is Mars in Cancer is the sign of Cancer is the sign of Mars's fall. And the fourth house is about housing, and Cancer sometimes represents, because it's ruled by the moon, which is all about family and home and stuff. There might be issues with housing. Housing should be relatively cheap, because we have Saturn weak in the fourth house, and should be relatively abundant, because Saturn is sextiled by Venus, which sounds great, but people just can't afford to bloody buy it. So even though there might be a fall in the housing prices, I think, just from traditional astrology rules, we have relatively cheap, relatively abundant housing. People can't afford to buy it. And again, it's interesting that we've got the part of fortune conjunct this star Zuben Ganubai, literally called the insufficient price. Also, just because the Scorpio rising, I'm thinking this year, 2023, going all the way through into spring 2024 in the UK, illness might affect the bowel. So if there's COVID going on, it may be more bowely than it has been in the past. I say that also because Scorpio rules the bowel. The ascendant ruler Mars is in the 8th house, which represents the bowel, and in Gemini, which is the 8th sign from Scorpio, which is Mars's own sign, and is also traditionally symbolically taken to represent the bowel. So I think there's three indications that inflammatory illness could affect the bowel here. And also the head, because we have Aries on the cusp of the 6th house. So inflammatory illness affecting those things. And illness is continuing to mutate because Mars is in Gemini, which is a double-bodied sign representing mutation, rules the 6th house of illness. There will be in this quarter, though, benefit from medicine. So as much as I've said, there's lots of rumors and concerns about reactions to particularly vaccination and stuff. And some of that will be true and some of it will be illusory and false because of that Mars square Neptune. We've got some benefits from medicine. Sorry, there's a child screaming outside, but don't know what that means, but but that's happening because we've got the 10th house with 16 Leo on the cusp and the sun ruling the 10th exalted in Aries in the 5th house. So that really strong sun ruling the 10th, there's benefits from medicine and I think from healthcare, particularly as regards children, because the 5th house represents children. And what else can I say about this chart? We've also got another part called the part of spirit, which is another composite between the sun, the moon, and the ascendant, is in the 12th house, which represents, amongst other things, hospitals and charities. That part is right on the star Speaker, which is a really fortunate, happy star. And we've got the ruler of Speaker, very strong, Venus in Taurus on the North Node, in the 7th house. I take that to mean we've got some real benefits for hospitals in this, thank God, finally. So there may be some real benefits for the healthcare sector from 2023 through to 2024, because we've got Jupiter in the 6th house, represents treatment of illness and illnesses generally. We've got the part of spirit, which represents where people's intentions are going. Where's the focus? What are people actively doing? And that's on Speaker, this really fortunate star in the 12th house, which represents charities and hospitals and prisons. But here we've got Venus ruling that placement, and Venus often represents things like it's a balm. Venus is a soothing balm in the 7th house. So this is focusing really on better provision of healthcare, I would say. So some benefits from the healthcare sector, perhaps an unclogging of a previous backlog, and illnesses mostly resolved in a more benign way. The mood of the people, as I've discussed, is anxious because Mars is in Gemini and in the 8th house. And then finally, for this last chart of the year, I'm going to look at the lunar mansion, which is where the moon is. The moon's at 18 degrees Pisces, which when we're looking at the tropical lunar mansions, is a mansion that is good for trade, but also, and I'm quoting from Christopher Warnock's book on the lunar mansions here, is said traditionally to destroy treasure. It increases travel, is good for relations and overseas allies, and, quote, inflicts evil on sailors, end quote. So that's fascinating. So in this year, I think that really, corroborates the idea that there's going to be a loss of income and money in 2023 through 2024 for the UK, but there will be definitely an increase in overseas travel, good for relationships, which on a countrywide level means better building of bridges and mending of fences with overseas allies and stuff. But despite it being good for travel, there might be a few sort of sea-based shipping incidents or something in that year. So that's it for the UK forecast. In terms of COVID, I think this chart definitely corroborates the idea that this is the final phase of COVID. Disease seems to become endemic. It's closing down. It's mainly about anxiety and sort of misinformation at this point. Some may argue it's always been about those things, but I would say this, in terms of COVID itself, there's a recognition it's become endemic and relatively, compared to how it was, benign. I hope you've enjoyed it. If you have enjoyed it, please subscribe to the channel, share this video. Sorry about the barking dog, and hopefully I'll see you next time. Bye.